pretty much it.
The point, you can't trust graduation goggles. They're just as misleading as beer goggles, bridesmaid goggles, and that's just a bulky, outdated cell phone in his front pocket goggles. That one was a bummer.
You're right. Tomorrow I'm quitting GNB.
No, you can't quit tomorrow. The lady with the big nipples is coming back to give another sexual harassment seminar, and I bribed one of the maintenance guys to keep the room at a brisk 55 degrees.
Baby, more than ever, you have my full support.
You know, sometimes I feel bad for Lily and Marshall.
I'm starting to feel bad for Ted and Zoe.
It starts with an L?
How can you not remember my name?
It's like they never challenge each other. They just automatically agree all the time.
Well, they don't do that all the time.
Yes, they do.
No, they don't.
Yes, they do.
It's like they don't see eye to eye on anything.
Totally.
It rhymes with your name.
And I said my name was...
Baby, I did it. I quit. And then I walked right over to the NRDC and I took that job.
Oh, good for you, sweetie.
Yeah, it's a little less money than I was expecting. I mean, compared to what I was making at GNB, it's nothing. Actually, compared to anything, it's nothing. It's nothing. The paid position just got filled, so all I can do is volunteer right now. You're cool with that, right?
Baby, if this...
Lord. Bring up the next person.
Old son, Alex. Here's Haley's story.
Right now,
Hundreds on our best-selling items with prices as low as $148, plus no interest for... Ashley Furniture Home Store. This is home. Shop now at ashleyfurniturehomestore.com.
Tonight, the 2-hour Chicago PD event. That's one surprise
You've been stripped of your police powers.
after another.
Why are we still trying to hide it?
Chicago PD, new tonight at a special time, 9/8 Central on NBC. And
back from preparing whatever lay in store for the POWs in the mountains. He looked different. The shade of a mustache darkened his lip. Louis saw him step into his office and close the door. On August 17th at Rokurooshi POW camp on the frigid summit of a Japanese mountain, a telephone rang. Phil, Fred Garrett, and more than 350 other POWs were shivering through summer inside the barracks, trying to survive on a nearly all-liquid diet. In this extremely remote, deathly quiet camp, the lone telephone hardly ever rang, and the POWs noticed it. A few minutes later, the Japanese commander hurried out of the camp and down the mountain. For some time, the prisoners had been racked with tension. All summer, the sky had been scratched with vapor trails. One night in July, the men had looked from the barracks to see the whole southern horizon lit up in red, generating light so bright that the men could read by it. On August 8th, the guards had begun nailing the barracks doors shut. Then, on August 15th, the guards had suddenly become much more brutal, and the POW's workload, breaking rocks on a hillside, had been intensified. After the commander left, something troubling happened. The guards began bringing the POWs out of the barracks and dividing them into small groups. Once they had the men assembled, they herded them out of camp and deep into the mountain forest, heading nowhere. After pushing the men on through the trees, for some time the guards led the men back to camp and into the barracks. Later, the walks were repeated. No explanation was given. The guards seemed to be inuring the men to this strange routine in preparation for something terrible. On August 20, a white sky stretched out over Noetsu, heavy and threatening. There was a shout in the compound. All POWs were to assemble outside. Some 700 men tramped out of the barracks and formed lines before the building. The little camp commander, gloves on his hands and a sword on his hip, stepped atop the air raid spotter's platform, and Kono climbed up beside him. The commander spoke, and Kono translated. "The war has come to a point of secession," he said. There was no reaction from the POWs. Some believed it, but kept silent for fear of reprisal. Others, suspecting a trick, did not. The commander went on, becoming strangely solicitous. Speaking as if the POWs were old friends, he voiced his hope that the prisoners would help Japan fight the Red Menace, the Soviet Union, which had just seized Japan's Kuril Islands. With the commander's speech finished and the POWs waiting in suspicious silence, Kono invited the POWs to bathe in the Hokura River. And this, too, was odd. The men had only rarely been allowed to go in the river. The POWs broke from their lines and began hiking down to the water, dropping clothes as they walked. Louis dragged along after them and peeled off his clothes and waded in. All over the river the men scattered, scrubbing their skin, unsure what was happening. And then they heard it. It was the growl of an aircraft engine, huge, low, and close. The swimmers looked up, and at first saw nothing but the overcast sky. And then there it was, bursting from the clouds, a torpedo bomber. As the men watched, the bomber dove, leveled off, and skimmed over the water, its engine screaming. The POWs looked up at it. The bomber was headed straight toward them. In the instant before the bomb shot overhead, the men in the water could just make out the cockpit and inside the pilot standing, and then the bomber was right over them. On each side of the fuselage and on the underside of each wing, there was a broad white star in a blue circle. The plane was not Japanese, it was American. The plane's red code light was blinking rapidly. A radio man in the water near Louis read the signals and suddenly cried out, "The war is over." In second, masses of naked men were stampeding out of the water and up the hill. As the plane turned loops above, the pilot waving, the POWs swarmed into the compound, out of their minds with relief and rapture. Their fear of the guards, of the massacre they had so long awaited, was gone, dispersed by the roar and muscle of the bomber. The prisoners jumped up and down, shouted and sobbed. Some scrambled onto the camp roofs, waving their arms and singing out their joy to the pilot above. Others piled against the camp fence and sent it crashing over. Someone found matches, and soon the entire length of fence was burning. The Japanese shrank back and withdrew. In the midst of the running, celebrating men, Louis stood on wavering legs, emaciated, sick, and dripping wet. In his tired mind, two words were repeating themselves over and over and over. I'm free. I'm free. I'm free. Down on the riverbank, a battered Australian POW named Matt Clift sat at the water's edge. His eyes were on the torpedo bomber, which was swooping overhead, alternately crossing over the river and then the camp. As Clift watched, something flittered out of the cockpit, trailing a long yellow ribbon. It carried through the air westward, directly toward the river. Clift stood up, leaned over the water, and reached out so far that he was on the verge of falling in. The object, a little wooden packet, dropped right into his hands. Regaining his balance with the treasure in his grasp, Clift had a delightful thought. Chocolate! His heart filled with gratitude for the damned good bloke of a pilot above. Clift spent some time trying to twist the packet open, and at some point realized, to his crushing disappointment, that it was not chocolate. When he finally got it open, he found a handwritten message inside. The message said, "Our torpedo bombers haven't been able to get through this stuff today. We'll lead them back tomorrow with food and stuff. Lieutenant A.R. Hawkins, VF-31, FPO Box 948, Lufkin, Texas." The pilot, Ray Hawkins, was a legend. In World War II, he shot down 14 Japanese planes, making him an ace nearly 3 times over, and was awarded 3 Navy Crosses. He went on to fly in the Korea War, then became a Blue Angels flight leader. He was the first man to eject from a jet at supersonic speed, and he survived. Before he flew off, Hawkins dropped 2 gifts, a candy bar with a bite taken out of it, and a 20-count packet of cigarettes with one missing. Fitzgerald had the candy bar sliced into 700 slivers, and each man licked a finger, dabbed it on his bit of chocolate, and put it in his mouth. Louis's portion was the size of an ant. Then Fitzgerald had the men form 19 circles, each of which received one cigarette. Each man got one delectable puff. Another American plane thrummed over, and a man fell out of it. Down and down he fell, and his parachute didn't open. Everyone gasped. Then they realized that it wasn't a man, it was a pair of pants stuffed full of something, the waist and leg holes tied shut. The officers retrieved the pants, and Louis stood among them as the waist was opened. Inside, sitting atop a pile of goods, was an American magazine. On the cover was a photograph of an impossibly voluminous bomb cloud. The men felt silent, piecing together the rumors of one giant bomb vaporizing Hiroshima and the abrupt end of the war. Below the magazine were cartons of cigarettes and candy bars, and very soon the compound was littered with wrappers and naked, skinny, smoking men. In a pocket, Fitzgerald found a letter belonging to the pants owner. The man had been busy. He had a wife in California and a girlfriend in Perth. The rock still sat at the foot of the barracks window, Louis's rope tied around it. But the conspirators were too late. The bird was nowhere to be found. Sometime that day, or perhaps the day before, he had taken off his uniform, picked up a sack of rice, and slipped into the Noetsu countryside and vanished. Chapter 32. Cascades of Pink Peaches. On August 22nd, Phil and Fred Garrett sat in the Rokurusho POW camp, wondering what was happening. Isolated on their chilly mountain, the POWs had been told nothing of the momentous events of the recent days. All they knew was that the camp commander had been gone for 5 days, and in his absence, the guards had been leading the POWs on ominous walks through the forest. That afternoon, the Japanese commander slogged back up the mountain looking wilted. He walked into the barracks and approached the ranking American, Lieutenant Colonel Marion Unruh. "The Emperor has brought peace to the world," he said. The commander surrendered his sword to Unruh, who gathered his men and told him that the war was over. The POWs immediately gathered for a Thanksgiving service. They were told that they must not seek revenge. They were officers and gentlemen, and they were to behave that way. The POWs promptly threw a party to end all parties. They demolished the camp fence and built a gigantic pile